Thank you very much for the introduction and indeed for the invitation to speak here today. It's always a difficult slot straight after lunch, so if I do fall asleep, please throw something at me. As you can see, my name's Trevor Gibson. I work for a small organisation called Opportunity Peterborough in the city of Peterborough, and the organisation is tasked with the economic development activity within the city. So there's a strong link there, we felt, between smart city work and indeed economic development in the city, hence the link. I'm also chair of the SDS2 committee, which Tom mentioned earlier, which oversees the standards in relation to smart cities and sustainable cities in the UK. I should apologise beforehand, I'm not a data scientist, nor am I an academic. At best, I'm a practitioner in this sort of world, in that I've spent most of my life working in cities for local authorities and then more latterly for Opportunity Peterborough, and also been involved in the production on various committees in the production of many of the standards that you saw described earlier, and I'll cover in a bit more detail. So this is really a hands-on view of standards and how they relate to cities, with a little bit about Peterborough's experience in that. Okay, always through, just find the right thing. Ah, there we are. Yeah, sorry. I've described what we're going to be doing today anyway, but I often get asked where the heck is Peterborough. So anyone that ever uses the East Coast Main Line has probably gone through it at 120 miles an hour. But that's where we are. We're sort of East Midlands, East Anglia, right on the cusp thereof. And for a small city, we've only got about 190,000 population. It's growing rapidly. But you'll see we're an area which is growing very rapidly. So fourth in the country for housing growth. On the smart city side and the data side, we were the UK's first gigabit city. We were designated World Smart City in 2015 for our thinking and work around circular cities, which is a big focus for us at the moment. Like Glasgow, we were part of the original Future City Demonstrator programme, which is, I think Jackie mentioned earlier. It was a competition that cities all across the UK entered. Glasgow won it, but we're not bitter. Glasgow won it, and we, along with two other UK cities, were also given a much smaller grant, but one that's enabled us to do some thinking and some good work in the city since. So that's Peterborough. Oops. Hang on. That's right, the buttons are in a different place to my keyboard, so keep hitting the wrong ones. Some fairly obvious statements up here, and it's come up in conversations earlier, around the complexity of cities. The complexity comes from the multiplicity of city services, the number of people and organisations required to deliver those, the fact that some of them will have votes to worry about, others will have profits to worry about, and a propensity, and it is a propensity, towards silo working. You know, sometimes the parts don't gel naturally together, and sometimes not. That's not because people don't want to, it's just when you come from different ends of a spectrum, it's quite hard to find that common ground. We have diverse populations with diverse need. That's a challenge and a huge opportunity as well. And rapidly changing national and international contexts, with May the 9th being the next one on the horizon, rapidly followed by Brexit, I expect. But in all of those changing contexts, one thing that will be a constant is the resource constraints, which, as you'll all be aware, gets harder as each years go by. So it does require, in all cities, new ways of thinking, new ways of working, and that's really what kicked off the whole smart city agenda in the first place. Although we've talked a lot about it today, nobody's actually put up the BSI definition, which I'll leave you to read at your leisure. But there's a few highlighted words in there which pick up some of the themes from the presentations earlier. Sustainability is in there, integration across the silos is in there. There's working across disciplines and better services and quality of life for those that live, work, etc. In the city. And the key words as well, collaborative. So the bit I mentioned earlier about how hard it is in a city to get the right people around the table. Again, there's a mention here that that's a key issue in delivering smart. Our response to the Future City Demonstrator Programme was something called Peterborough DNA. We felt it was something that was at the very heart of how the city operated, so we came up with the title and the fairly logo. We didn't have T-shirts printed, though they would have looked really good, I think. And as things stand at the moment, we have 3 key themes in what we do. And as I say, I'm not going to go into detail about what we do under each of these, but intelligence is obviously the bit that's relevant to the data today. So looking at how we can use data differently, better, engaging with citizens and so on. Enabling, so this is about working with small businesses and other organisations in the city to help them to help us develop solutions and involving as many people as possible. And that collaborative piece, really trying to work across organisations and across silos to really maximise the opportunities that thinking and working differently can offer. So how can standards help that role? And I've put together here a couple of slides which just have some summary bullet points on them. I mentioned earlier that cities are complex places, and so one role of standards, and certainly the smart city standards, is they can begin to reduce or simplify that complexity. I'll show you a still from, or a picture from PAS 181 later, which will show that in some detail. It supports smart city leadership. It suggests ways, perhaps, in which cities can work together by finding that sometimes elusive common ground. And it can drive wider stakeholder engagement. If you've got a document produced by a recognised organisation like BSI, then you're more likely to get people, I think, round a table because it has a legitimacy because of the way that it's been put together. It can provide a compendium of linked guidance in some instances. So PAS 183, which Jackie was the author of, you heard earlier, that not only talks about the journey forward, but also pulls in areas where you can find further guidance and support. What else is out there that are relevant to this particular topic? So data sharing in that particular instance. We've heard a lot about case studies in the production of standards, and again, standards offer a way of getting those case studies, getting people to use the standards in practice and gather the added value, hopefully, that has been created as a result. And fundamentally, if all of that happens, they can increase the pace of change in a city, the speed of the journey, if you like. On the wider agenda, standards can provide, in the smart city world particularly, the right conditions to support and enable innovation, to help entrepreneurs and existing businesses, even school children, whatever, to come up with ideas, new ways of looking at traditional problems. That can lead to business opportunities and hopefully some of those feed back in and start to help to solve some of the complex challenges that cities have. And another role of standards is that they can enable cities to monitor their progress, and I'll cover one example of that from another British standard shortly. You've seen this picture on the right in Tom's presentation, but this the sketch on the right was actually produced at a very early workshop when BSI, with a whole host of stakeholders, was determining how it should decide which areas of activity in the smart city world should be the focus of standards. You know, how do we break up the complexity of cities? What do cities need? And what should we produce to be of maximum benefit? And in summary, again, as Tom was describing in some of his slides, you've got the different levels from strategic, if you look at the box on the right, the strategic down to the very technical specifications. And I guess most of the smart city standards have focused on level 1 with occasional drops into level 2, rather than the very specific technical details around perhaps sensors and telecommunications and so on. So the leadership guide, management frameworks, interoperability, that sort of higher level thinking has been the main focus. The story so far, again, and this is out of date in a different way to Tom's, because I have indicated that 183 and 184 were launched recently, but a couple of these have now got ISO numbers. But you'll see there, I think, the true power of the work that BSI has done and why it's of interest internationally is that it starts with an overview and a framework on the left-hand side. So before dropping down into technical details around telecommunications, around sensors, around IoT, and so on, it starts with that high-level umbrella framework of a city, and then hangs a number of more specific guides and standards off it. So it tells a story, if you like, which is important for helping any city on a journey towards smartness. Something else I'll talk about a bit later is the Smart City Leadership Programme, which is, again, an example of how we in Peterborough have used, in collaboration with others, the standards to sort of drive forward leadership thinking. I mentioned at the outset that I've been involved in, I think, most of the standards that are on that list over the years. I think there's one or two I wasn't involved in, but colleagues from Peterborough were involved in them. So we've been actively engaged in setting or helping set some of this agenda and guidance for other cities. So again, just a reflection from a city perspective, personal perspective if you like, of the process which Tom described earlier in some detail. It's really engaging, participative, informative. You learn a lot, or I've certainly learned a lot just through going through the process of developing standards, because of the mix of expertise and experience in the room, whatever the subject matter. And the fact that that BSI involve a whole range of practitioners means that the resultant document is far more accessible and far more practical and relevant to cities, whatever their size, challenges and locations. The use of case studies, again, really valuable in bringing real practical thoughts. And if there's one weakness in some of the activity that we get involved in as a city, it's quite hard to find repositories of good practice. You'll hear presentations from a variety of cities like Peterborough, like Milton Keynes and others, but actually getting a repository somewhere of best practice or things that are happening not just in the UK but around the world in one place is really valuable. I think the standards make a start on that process because it does pull together case studies around particular topics. And again, as Tom mentioned in his presentation, the key challenge is ensuring that we make those standards as available as possible, that we get them into not just into cities, but the right people in those cities, so that they can make best use of them. And having made best use of them, whether it's a good experience or a bad experience, that's the collective, we need to hear back so that we can capture the good news, learn from some of the things that didn't quite work, and promote that information to, again, hopefully encourage others to do the same. So, looking at the portfolio of standards I mentioned previously, that story so far, slide, we've developed what we call our future city framework, or our future Peterborough framework, which very much builds on the PAS 181 approach, looking at the components. I'll show you that in a bit more detail in a moment, looking at the components that make up a smart city and seeing where our areas of focus should be, which are the bits that we're strong on, which are the bits that we need to devote attention to. So we've tried as much as possible to build in elements of that very good thinking. On the data side, certainly with regard to PAS 183 and also PAS 182, which was the concept model for data, I know that it's helping my colleagues on the digital side of things to really get wider buy-in from officers and members within the authority about the importance and value of data, and also the fact that there is a structured approach to sharing it, making it available, and so on, with all of the respective security considerations that need to be taken on board. And again, as I mentioned earlier, big value in something like PAS 183 in particular on the data side is that it simplifies a massively complex, certainly as a non-data person, it simplifies a massively complex world of data, of guidance, of approaches into a document that's quite easy to read, again, even as a non-data specialist. So again, I think that sort of approach is helping, again, colleagues getting others to look and read and buy into this transition, as Jackie mentioned, from open to shared data. I mentioned earlier the PAS 181 diagrams, and there are some similarities in this with other diagrams we've seen today. And I'm not expecting you to read all of that, obviously, but I think just as a glance shows you or illustrates the current challenges within cities, the fact that you have a variety of providers, therefore varieties of data, and the fact that it's split in that way, or that cities traditionally, not universally, but traditionally operate in that way, makes it difficult to find those real nuggets of innovation that work across a number of areas. And it also makes it quite difficult for a citizen or a business, because there's those multiple connections into multiple worlds just for them to get through the average day. So the move, what PAS 181 advocates, is a move from that sort of picture to this more citizen-centric. It was one of the top scorers on Simon's slide, I remember, Citizencentric Services. And again, just pulling the components together, not from a silo perspective, but in a more integrated way, with key success factors, guiding principles, the business management side of it, and so on. So a much more structured approach. And again, the fact that as a city, you can look at different components on there, focus on particular areas, weaknesses, strengths, and so on, but at least almost as a checklist, a guide for designing your smart city journey. I mentioned also on an earlier slide how we've used PAS 181 in something called the Smart City Leadership Programme. We developed this with, Opportunity Peterborough developed this in partnership with BSI and with a company called Urban DNA. And it basically uses the components from that earlier slide I showed you in PAS 181 and starts to use that as a basis for a new way of thinking about city leadership. Again, it's far too small for you to read. This was one of the outputs from the one we tested out in Peterborough. But it starts from a basic approach of getting key people from a city leaders collectively in a room and getting them to understand and agree what smart city means, what smart Peterborough in our case means, where we are on that journey, and then supports them in working towards developing a roadmap, which is the schematic in the middle at the bottom, which is really mapping out the journey from where we are now to where we want to be. We've refined that quite a bit since. This was a couple of years ago now. We've refined it quite a lot since, and whilst the traction in the UK cities has been very slow on the uptake, there's a lot of interest, but no takers, to put it bluntly. Significant interest from India, particularly. So we've recently delivered this program in 2 Indian cities, and are in discussions with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office about widening that scope out. And we're also in discussions with Cyprus and with Taiwan as well about possible programs in those countries. So again, some interesting developments again around the importance of standards. I mentioned earlier about the ability to monitor progress. PD 8100, which is part of this suite of standards I mentioned earlier, has a very simple maturity matrix within it, which is used as part of the leadership program. But basically looking at the smart city components in view of those high level boxes on the left hand side, and some indicators about where some of the explanation behind those. There's a lot more detailed version behind it, but this is a version we can use just to get people to score very quickly as part of an exercise on the programme. And you'll see the second column are the references back to PAS 181. So if you want to see the origins of some of those statements and some of that thinking, again, it's referenced all the way back. And the output's very simple. You know, you map out, I think this was the one from Peterborough, you map out where you currently are collectively, you agree that the black dotted line, and then you decide where you want to be in 5, 10, 20 years time, and develop your action plan or roadmap accordingly. That's about me in terms of content, but just to give you an overview of some of the key messages which I hope I've brought out. It's very clear for a whole variety of reasons that cities need new approaches to how they develop as cities going forward. We went through that earlier. I think the BSI suite of standards, from a personal perspective and having been involved in their production, I think offer one set of tools to help that process along. And the fact that so many people are involved and so many people from different backgrounds are involved really helps that process along. And the ongoing challenge, as always, is to get the standards used, to pull back case studies and to reinforce the messages, and indeed review standards and develop new standards in this area based on feedback. So that's broadly all I wanted to say. Having started with an apology about not being an academic or a data, I just thought I'd finish with a bit of humour, if that's appropriate in the afternoon, because I was reminded of a story, being in a room of many data scientists. I was reminded of a story recently of a chap in a balloon flying over the UK countryside, and he sees someone sat in a field and shouts down, "Excuse me, do you know where I am?" And the person in the field shouts back with very detailed description of altitude, longitude, latitude, airspeed, ground speed, general direction, and so on. The guy shouts down, "Are you a data scientist?" The person shouts back, "Yes, are you a city leader?" And they said, "Well, how did you know that?" And they said, "Because you've no idea where you are, you've no idea where you're going, you got into that mess by getting off a load of hot air, and now you expect the data analyst to sort it out." Thank you.
Thank you very much. Trevor, any questions or comments following that?
Hi, that sounds really amazing. I had a question about the leadership aspect. So there's been quite a lot of talk about citizen-centric and the role of citizens and trying to unpick what that means. I assume that part of being citizen-centric could mean that citizens play some role in leadership and decision-making And I wonder whether you explored that or had any engagement in that.
I mean, we have. I guess all cities have. It's not new to try and involve citizens in various aspects ongoing. But it also has, limitations. Not everybody wants to be involved, and I think part of solutions, smart city solutions, or smart city journeys, if one asks themselves how much people need to be aware of what's going on in terms of initiatives and so on, probably the ideal is that they don't. They just feel that their life has improved and the buses are easier and that this is easier, that's easier. But there'll always be key people who would like to be involved, and providing in the thinking and the design. So I think providing those meaningful opportunities, and again I use that word advisedly, much more than consultation. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? But actually having user groups that help design some of the services. And indeed, if you have part of a leadership cohort, we did when we did the leadership program in Peterborough, we invited people from sort of non-governmental organisations and from a number of community groups, with the hope of, we couldn't invite everybody, but if we had people that worked at the grassroots level and could see the advantages, what was wrong with the city, what was right with the city, that was a useful balance to the, shall we say, professional view of service delivery and other aspects of the context. So yeah, I think it's absolutely critical, as has been said many times, but it's the appropriate engagement for what it is you're seeking to achieve that's important, rather than a sort of blanket consultation.
Did you come across the Bristol approach, which was almost entirely citizen-led, so there was a widespread community-based consultation not taken by the local authority, which identified damp as a key issue. And there was then a grassroots development of sensors, which were the data from which I think was not given to the local authority, but it was acted upon as part of a dialogue between residents and landlords. And so that seemed to be actually rather nice, smart city development, which didn't involve local authority at all, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, and I am aware of the Bristol one. They're also one of the 4 future city demonstrator cities. So we keep in touch with them, and that and a number of other examples that have really engaged with citizens in meaningful ways have been really valuable. From the Peterborough perspective, we have one of the things we've done, which is has been to develop something called the Smart Suppers, where we get lots of school children working in groups on particular city challenges, and then the outputs from that, we work with the winning groups in a bit more detail to try and refine some of those solutions, and there may even be possibilities for them to start mini businesses and so on. So again, very much grassroots. We've thrown out we have challenged, persuaded more people to recycle, or recycling rates going down, or people complain about bus information, and getting groups of people to think up solutions from a completely different perspective. And we have another group it's called Digital Peterborough, I think, imaginatively, but it's people with an interest in, sometimes they're people that work in the field. We have Compare the Market as one of the biggest employers in Peterborough, so there's a lot of digital people in the city, a lot of meerkats as well, but no, we have a lot of digital people in the city, and also just people who are interested in it, and they come together from time to time, and we use them to sort of try and look at things differently. So there's a lot of that learning going on, and I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think perhaps one of the things that someone, collectively perhaps even, we could fix is capturing all those in one place. So a few keywords puts you in touch with Bristol, with Peterborough, with whoever. Around particular topics, and at the moment you have to dig around a bit or attend conferences or whatever to find that.
As an extension of the last point that Ewan was making about Bristol, would I be right in thinking that as we begin to get a smarter city, we should be seeing a complete shrinkage in the size of the administration and the organisational components of the city, with more scope for self-organising groups within the city? And if you agree with that, has there been any evidence within the Peterborough experience that that's been happening?
Okay, it's a good question, because there are two aspects of work there. The resource constraints means that local authorities are having to think in, I'd like to say it more positively, but actually they're being forced to thinking about service delivery differently. And I know in Peterborough and in many other areas, the sort of self-help, the enabling and empowering groups to deliver things that the local authority at one time would traditionally have delivered. So you would hope that they will be shaped and tailored more closely to a community needs, rather than a blanket blueprint across a city. So I think there are two pressures at work here. I think there's a growing awareness and demand from certain citizens, from not all, to start doing things a bit more for themselves. But also, I think perhaps for the first time in recent history, there's probably an openness from a local authority administration to talk in very real terms about that, because what we do at the moment is just not sustainable in financial and practical terms. So I think you're right. I think it is changing. I think it's changing for the better. And probably having started down that route, it's probably never going to go back to the model that I grew up in, because I spent most of my life in local authority. It's already very different, and I think 10 years' time it will be different again, but hopefully with much greater community insight and empowerment.
Hello, sir.
Hi.
See, I would like to ask you a very general question. The thing is, like, how do we cope up with the tension between very strong political parties and the participatory planning approach? Because sometimes what happens is, like, some of the political parties just want to invest on like huge infrastructure investments without knowing what the real community wants, just to keep up with the image of the city or whatever. So sometimes, it's not a very hand-in-hand situation. So in general, how do we cope up with it?
That's probably something that would take all afternoon to discuss in terms of, because again, like some of the other things we've discussed today, people have been trying to solve that for a long time without success, and politics inevitably always gets in the way. Thinking back to my local government career, there were two types of politicians, two types of elected members, and the same is true at national level. There are those that live and breathe their community, and so when they come and see you as an officer, as I was in the local authority, they had very real issues and lots of information, and they demand certainly attention and action. And then at the other extreme were those that, even though I did the same job for 10 years as a senior professional in local government, I never saw some councillors. So you either assume they were not in tune with their local communities, not interested perhaps, or that for some reason their communities never had any planning problems or litter problems, which is extremely unlikely. So I think you're always going to get that. And really the responsibility, I guess, lies with us all, because it's about who you put your cross against, and most, I say most, I've no data to back that up, but I suspect most people put a tick by the party rather than the name. And actually, if you thought about the name and what they're doing for their constituency, and you, the resident or whatever, we probably would have more of what you are describing than we currently do. But so long as we continue to be partisan, and particularly in local elections, put crosses by a political party, you're probably never going to get the ideal situation of having real, as I would call them, proper councillors that know their area inside out. Just an observation.
Thanks. We have to leave it there, but thank you.
Thank you.